I'm Jacques deLisle, the director of the Asia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We have a terrific program today on assessing the Taiwan elections that just happened last weekend. Joining me today are two old friends. We have Vincent Wang, who is a senior fellow with the Asia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is also dean and professor of political science at Adelphi University. He was previously dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences at Ithaca College, and before that he was professor of political science and chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Richmond. He's written widely on international political economy and Asian studies, particularly with a focus on Taiwan, cross-Strait relations, the rise of China, and other such issues. He's been visiting professor at National Zhengzhou University in Taiwan, in Taipei, and National Sun Yat-sen University in Kaohsiung. He's written many things in many places. I'll just highlight one, which is he's a contributor and co-author in the volume we did a couple of years ago, on Taiwan under Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan in the Tsai era, co-edited by me and June Dreyer. Phil Hsu is also joining us. He's a professor of political science and director of the Center for China Studies at National Taiwan University. He is currently serving as a Fulbright Scholar and a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's on the board of the Association of International Relations in Taiwan and the advisory committee of the Straits Exchange Foundation, the unofficial, whatever body by which Taiwan conducts interchanges with the mainland, or at least did before the current freeze on contacts. He also served as chair of the Department of Political Science at NTU and president of the Chinese Association of Political Science in Taipei. He's also on the advisory commission of the Mainland Affairs Council of Taiwan's Executive Yuan, the body that conducts those relations at the more state level. He too has written and published very widely on issues of Taiwan and China, including co-editor and contributor to the book A Search for China's Development Model Beyond the Beijing Consensus, in which I have the pleasure of having a chapter. So it's great to welcome two friends to discuss this, and I really can't imagine two better colleagues to discuss the implications of this election. I mean, if you wanted to get into sort of nitty-gritty voter turnout and things like that, there's a lot of people who do that in Taiwan, but I suspect of greater interest to our audience is the sorts of issues we'll be discussing today, on which Phil and Vincent are really terrific sources. So I'm going to open with a bit of framing about what happened for those of you who didn't follow the elections terribly closely. Basically, these are called the 9-in-1 elections. They were held Saturday in Taiwan, and they elect officials to 9 different types of posts throughout the island's government, and hence the name. Roughly 11,000 officials are elected, but the big deal elections are for the 16 county magistrates and the 6 mayors of the major cities. Only 21 of those were selected this time around because one election was postponed because of the death of a candidate. That'll be held in December, kind of their own little Herschel Walker, Raphael Warnock postponement of final decisions. These are sometimes called midterms, although they are in fact not really midterms. They're roughly 2/3 of the way through the 4-year period between Taiwan's legislative and presidential elections, which occur on a 4-year cycle. The next one's coming up in January 2024. These elections are sometimes, but not always, seen as a referendum on the party in power, or a predictor of what will happen in the presidential and legislative elections to be held 14 months later. This time what happened was a pretty striking result in some ways, although most of it not unexpected. In 2022, this very recent round of elections, we have, of the 22 seats up for grabs at the mayor and county magistrate level, 13 won by the Kuomintang, the current opposition party, but long the ruling party. 5 won by the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which currently holds the presidency and a majority in the Legislative Yuan. 1 held by the new Taiwan People's Party, which is a party created by the outgoing mayor of Taipei, Ko Wen-je, who may also be a presidential candidate next time around. 2 independents, and of course the 1 election that is still undecided. That's a contrast to where we were after the 2018 elections, when the lineup was 15 for the KMT, 6 for the DPP, and the 1 independent, Ke in Taipei, which became 14-7-1 after Han Kuo-yu, the failed KMT presidential candidate, who was mayor of Kaohsiung, the second largest, there's other major city down south, after he was recalled, and the seat was, he was originally from the KMT, he was recalled and defeated, replaced by a DPP candidate. So everybody expected the KMT would win. Didn't quite reach Eric Zhu, the party chairman's stated goal of 16 seats. But in some ways, the defeat for the DPP was a bit worse than it looked. The KMT won back Taipei, which had been, again, under the so-called independent, now TPP, party head Ke. Not an unexpected result, but it was won by a rising KMT star, Jiang Wanan, who was seen as a future possible presidential candidate. The KMT won back the major city of Taoyuan after losing it in 2014 and again in 2018. And the KMT also held on to the major cities of New Taipei and Taichung with big wins of 20% plus. An independent won in the small Miaoli election, but he was previously KMT, so should we count him as an independent or not is a question. He basically lost the party primary and then went on to run as an independent and win. And in Jinmen, one of the very small islands off the coast of the main island, not too far from the mainland, the incumbent, who had also a KMT background, jumped back into the race at the last moment and won. So he too is hardly a DPPer. These are both kind of KMT wins. The DPP kept its strongholds in the major cities of Tainan and Kaohsiung in Taiwan South. But the margin was pretty small in Tainan. The only pickup that the DPP made was tiny Penghu, where they beat the KMT incumbent. That's kind of small consolation for losing the major city of Taoyuan and the pretty substantial city of Hsinchu, one of which went to the KMT and one of which went to the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, Ko Wen-je's party, in the first local election that they have won. And the TPP did pretty well in that it actually won a seat in Hsinchu. And it's a big contrast to the 2014 election, which was a big loss for the KMT, right? In that round 8 years ago, the final tally was 6 KMT, 13 DPP, and 3 independents, including Ke in the biggest city of Taipei. And among the big 6 cities, the 6 special municipalities, that time around, the KMT had won only New Taipei, where the current party chairman and possible future presidential candidate and past presidential candidate, Eric Zhu, won a very narrow re-election. If we look at the city and county council seats, there's been a lot more stability in the last 3 rounds, 2014, 2018, and now 2020. The KMT gets around 40% plus a bit of the vote. The DPP has fluctuated somewhere around 30, and about 25% are independents, although independents sometimes lean strongly toward one party or another. Finally, this election also included a referendum on lowering the voting age from the current 20 to 18. That failed, not because most voters who showed up did not vote for it. It actually got a majority of the votes cast, roughly 5.6 million to about 5 million. But it failed to reach the very high threshold set under Taiwan's constitution, pursuant to 2005 amendments, that say that a referendum requires first passage in the legislature by at least 3/4, and the parties got together on this one with essentially unanimous support, and then requires a majority of the votes cast reaching a majority, total the majority of eligible voters, and it fell well short of that in an election where turnout was relatively low, it was about 60%, and it's very hard to hit that 50% of the electorate threshold if you've only got 60% showing up to vote in either direction. So that's a long windup. I've set the stage here. Let me say one more housekeeping thing I should have done at the start of our session here, which is that thank you for joining us in the audience. And if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. We'll be keeping an eye on that as our discussion proceeds today. So if you put them in early, we'll try to weave the questions into our initial discussion. And of course, we'll save some time at the end to raise any questions we haven't got to. All right, well, I've gone on much too long here, so let me throw it open to my colleagues on the panel here. As those numbers that I just went through suggest, this is generally seen as a loss for the DPP. And it's certainly been the way it's been reported. And the current president of the Republic of China and Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, has now stepped down as party chairman of the DPP because of the losses, which is a fairly common thing to do in Taiwan when your party is seen as having lost. Well, why did the DPP lose, assuming that it's fair to characterize this as indeed a DPP loss? I think I'll throw it first to Phil on this.
Okay. I guess there are several major reasons. The first is the DPP's relative failure in terms of handling COVID in the past 2 or 3 years. The second is all the blemishes in terms of public governance and the personal integrities on the part of many DPP or some DPP candidates or the incumbent DPP magistrates. The third is the so-called strategic voting on the part of many voters in Taiwan, especially in the case of Hsinchu and Taipei. And finally, I think there are problems in terms of in other aspects of public governance. For example, there have been a growing number of cases that provided reasonable doubt on part of the public minds that there might be collusions between organized crimes on one hand and high-ranking officials in the police, the prosecutors, and the anti-corruption agencies controlled by the DPP government. So that's all.
Okay, that's all. That's rather a lot of issues. Vincent, would you agree with that list, or would you add to it?
Largely agree. I think this is a DPP loss, but I think if you interpret it against maybe the unrealistically high expectation that the DPP would have done better, because I think the number one reason is that for this election, both major parties, have actually chosen to nominate candidates rather than through the sort of a more grassroots primary system. So Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP chairperson and the president of ROC, basically have staked her own reputation on the outcome of this election. So the result actually is a severe setback for her reputation and her stature. And I think that the reason why we would imagine that the election to be less than the loss was unrealistic. One reason was that several incumbents are actually faring very well. For example, the KMT incumbents in Xinbei and in Taichung, these are strong candidates and they are doing pretty well. And in Taiwan, the voters seem to be quite capable of pendulum swing, so one side and the other, and they reward good governance, and they are also not hesitant to throw out bad officials. Another thing Philip already mentioned, that because the both party chairpersons have centralized the nomination process, and the DPP has made some missteps. I think the largest one is actually their initial nominee for the Taoyuan municipality. Lin Zhijian was the former mayor of Hsinchu, was found responsible or guilty of plagiarism, and also there are some public work missteps. I think another very important reason is that although Tsai Ing-wen was trying to frame this ostensibly local election as sort of at a very high level of national security, anti-China, and so on, for very good reasons, this tactic did not gain traction in this election. And I think that the Taiwan voters seem also quite comfortable of going with DPP's or any party's mainstream view that that the ruling party should safeguard Taiwan's sovereignty and dignity and independence and so on. But at the same time, the Taiwan voters want to ask, what have you done for me lately? And I think that it's those local issues that matter more. And finally, you have already mentioned that the voter turnout this time is around 60% overall, which is low for Taiwan standards. And we know that usually when a lower voter turnout tends to favor the opposition party, and because the traditional supporters of the DPP, the ruling party, do not feel there's much for them to cheer for and therefore to come out for. So I think these are some of the reasons why this is characterized as a DPP loss.
Okay, well, thanks. And I want to assure our audience we will turn to the questions of what this means for the 2024 elections and what it means for cross-strait and U.S. Ties. But first, I want to unpack that sort of rich menu you both have given us to understand what happened here, partly because Taiwan is a significant and thriving democracy in many ways, and there are certain analogies to the issues we see in our own country, but also if you want to project what's going to happen here, I think it's important to understand the factors that played in this election that don't translate terribly neatly to U.S. relations or cross-strait relations, that they are somewhat internal to Taiwan. But let's unpack some of these. So I think the first one that Philip mentioned was the COVID issue. And that may sound a little remarkable to our audience because, after all, Taiwan has been seen as a relative success story in COVID, right? It managed to keep the rates pretty low and did so without a real authoritarian crackdown. So it had sort of all the openness of the U.S. in terms of its politics and lack of really severe restrictions on individual liberty, but with a COVID rate that was really quite low, that looked very good in comparison to most other countries in the region and elsewhere, certainly compared to what we've seen here. It's sort of in the New Zealand range in some sense of keeping this under control. So how did that turn from a success story, indeed one that Taiwan made considerable international hay out of, the Taiwan Can Help story, lots of people looking to Taiwan and its success in controlling COVID, Taiwan actually exporting PPE and things like that in the early phases of the pandemic. And again, having a vice president at the beginning of the pandemic who was a public health expert, it all looked pretty good. And now you're saying, but it turned out to be a liability for that same party that had been in charge of the successful response. So how did we get from A to B here? Phil, can I throw it to you first? You're muted.
Okay. I guess the story of success sort of began to be reversed around the middle 2021. The success was typified by what happened during 2020, the first year after the pandemic broke out. But in 2021, many things have changed. Well, for example, many voters' memory of the DPP administration's inability to provide enough effective vaccines and PCR test kits at the apex of COVID in 2021 was very critical. Their memory was different from the seeming image of Taiwan widely reported in international media as a case of success in combating COVID. Lying behind the inability was the indigenously developed vaccine in Taiwan called Medigan, which was strongly endorsed by President Tsai herself and various high-ranking officials in 2021. But the Medigan never went through, for example, the phase 3 clinical trial, which has been necessary for all vaccines approved of by WHO. So Medigan has not been approved by WHO anyway, and has shown inadequate effectiveness. Worse yet, when some major enterprise groups and NGOs in Taiwan tried to purchase the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines from abroad themselves because of the government's priority of Medigan instead of otherwise, the DPP administration behaved in ways that were viewed widely in Taiwan as deliberately dragging the foot of such purchase. And this was during the period when lots of Taiwanese became increasingly panicking about the lack of enough vaccines that really worked. So this memory, which was about the life and death issue, affected elections in most jurisdictions this time, but was particularly significant in Taipei, where the DPP candidate, Mr. Chen Shizhong, happened to be the health minister during the pandemic until mid-July this year.
Yeah, fair enough. I was going to point out, yes, Chen Shizhong made it a particularly striking challenge, or striking almost referendum on the regime response. Ironic echo here a bit of the mainland, where of course we're seeing protests now based on a zero COVID lockdown, where there are many, many issues, including restrictions on civil liberties and mobility that are far, far more severe than anything we've seen in Taiwan. But there's a vaccine component too. Part of the concern is China's vaccine nationalism and a refusal to open up fully to Pfizer and Moderna and so on. But part of it also, of course, is just rising rates. When you open up, when you relax a little bit, rates do rise, and then that raises concern. Vincent, do you want to weigh in on this topic?
I think Philip has given a pretty good list. When the case count initially was low, and Taiwan maintained a very strict closed border policy, it was very successful. And the situation would change, as Philip mentioned, when the COVID became very more transmissible, all these variants. And Taiwan, unlike many other countries, find itself ill-equipped with effective vaccines and all that. So I think that was, sort of a a setback for the DPP, and then the effort to support domestic support. I think that the larger issue is that even though the Taiwanese people have been very cooperative, but all the restrictions on civil liberties and the business activities and so on have been going on for more than 2 years, and it is really long enough. And although the Taiwanese government had gradually relaxed the requirements of quarantine and so on, but domestic tourism, outgoing tourism and incoming tourism and so on are also affected. And the Chen Shizhong, the DPP mayor, actually became the lightning rod because he was the nominee for Taipei mayoral election, and that in hindsight, it might have been a miscalculation on the part of Tsai Ing-wen to nominate Chen Shizhong as the DPP nominee for Taipei. So I think that this also shows us that that the vaccine has actually played tricks on the political fortune of major parties, that you could be successful one time, but given the trajectory of the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years, no strategy can work forever. So I think the DPP probably did not anticipate this either.
Okay, fair enough. So one of the other issues that you both flagged in various ways is what we would call in the United States candidate quality issues, which is partly a substantive matter. So we have the plagiarism scandal, which you referred to with former Hsinchu mayor Lin Zhejian, who had to withdraw and be replaced as a candidate for the mayoralty in Taiyuan. It actually echoed a little bit what happened in the by-election to replace Han Guoyu down in Kaohsiung in 2020, where there was a plagiarism scandal that hit the KMT candidate. So there's these kinds of integrity problems. You referred also to the question of candidate selection, where there's always been this, or at least has long been this, tension about how to pick nominees. Do you do an open primary? Do you do a poll? Does the top leader get to pick the candidates, sometimes successfully and some not? So is there anything else in this mix of what we would call candidate quality issues that went on in these 9-in-1 elections? I guess the other thing one could throw into that list is a second process question, which is this sort of factionalism within the parties, especially in some of the minor races. We saw multiple people with KMT backgrounds, in a sense, getting into the race and causing a bit of chaos there. I guess I'll start with Vincent on this one.
Okay. So the candidate quality issue, it is actually important, and it has been proven in the Taiwanese elections. So the DPP initial nominee for Taoyuan, as I mentioned before, the former mayor of Hsinchu, Lin Zhejian, he was found plagiarizing on 2 master's theses, one at National Taiwan University, the other at Zhonghua University. And this is actually a boomerang on the DPP, because they first started this against the KMT candidate for the by-election of Kaohsiung mayor in 2000. And so this became almost like a very unique phenomenon in Taiwan election, namely that every time candidates come aboard, that you have these pundits or netizens will go on to verify their degrees. And I think that the fact that Taiwan is still still a society that reveres educational achievements, to me, that politicians do not need to promote a degree that they don't have. They don't need that. But the fact that they want to work on a sort of an executive master's degree actually contributes to this fast food master's thesis, which was also a problem. So I think the candidate integrity, sort of the honesty, is definitely a very important issue in Taiwan politics.
Okay, Philip?
I think what I can also add is that the problem of Lin Zhijian on surface seemed to be a problem of his own, but actually it has brought about lots of spillover effect beyond Hsinchu. And the prime reason was because soon after the sort of scandal broke out, President Tsai Ing-wen, in the capacity of the DPP chairperson, probably still endorsed Lin Zhijian. And she said that the whole party should be standing behind Lin Zhijian. And up until this point, no major members or major officials of the DPP has publicly recognized that Lin Zhijian has indeed committed plagiarism. So I think that's also a sort of that sort of created a systematic effect that contributed to the what we call a failure by the DPP this time.
Philip, the other thing you mentioned was strategic voting by voters, particularly in Hsinchu and Taipei. Would you spell out a little bit what you mean by that?
Okay. In the case of Hsinchu, and as Jacques has pointed out, the winner was Ms. Gao Hong'an, or Dr. Gao Hong'an, who is from the TPP. As a matter of fact, the one prime reason why Gao Hong'an is able to achieve the victory is because lots of the originally KMT supporters, switched to vote for Gao Hong'an. A lot of, for example, local politicians on the part of KMT, toward the final stage of the campaign, public stood out to say that there was little hope for Mr. Lin Gengren, who was the KMT candidate, to prevail in the end. So they called for their supporters to vote for Gao Hong'an instead of Mr. Lin Gengren. So this is what we call strategic voting, where voters may choose to support not their most favorite candidate, but to kick out their least favorite candidate by choosing the second best. So that's what we call strategic voting.
Okay. And another issue that's that you referred to here is the sort of question of candidates who, so individual candidates' positions. So we may have to disaggregate this a bit. I mean, one of the striking things here is that incumbency does seem to have had some advantages, right? That is, we've seen a lot of incumbents who are up and did pretty well in the attempt to get back in office. So there were several people who were term limited out, but there were certainly some who were not. And among those who were not, we saw a relatively decent success rate. I think, I'm just looking for the numbers here. I think we had something like 7 KMT candidates up for re-election at the county magistrate or city mayor limited level, and we had I think what was it, 3 from the DPP. So we saw Chen Qimai in Kaohsiung and Huang Weizhe in Tainan getting reelected for the DPP as well as one other. And the big names on the KMT side, we saw Hou Youyi in Xinbei and New Taipei City getting reelected, and in Taichung, Liu Xiaoyi also reelected, plus 5 smaller ones. And we also had openings in Taipei and Taoyuan, 2 other major cities, because the incumbents were term limited. The former independent, now TPP, Ko Wen-je in Taipei being the noble one. So in some sense, this is fairly ordinary stuff, right? If you're an incumbent and you're not perceived as doing a terrible job, you come in with some advantages and you get reelected. But the other thing that was in a lot of the commentary on the election was, of course, COVID was an issue, but there's also saying these are local issues or these are economic issues. Is that a fair characterization? I mean, one of the things we've seen in Taiwan election after election is it's always going to be more about local issues, even in the presidential and LY, the legislative elections, although those seem always to wind up being partly about China. But when we're talking about these 9-in-1s, is this a case where really voters are deciding on, as you suggested, local candidate quality, but also local issues, local economic issues and things like that? As Philip pointed out, COVID was a much bigger deal in Taipei than it was elsewhere. So what's the landscape look like there? We can't go into it in great detail, but if you have a couple of quick thoughts on that. I guess I'll start with Vincent on this one.
So I think that as the former U.S. House Speaker Tip O'Neill said that all politics are local. I think that should be the starting point. Yes, there are some common themes of candidates of the same party, but there are also some local issues. I think the large picture for this election is that the Taiwan economy seems to be doing fine, doing well. Given the pandemic, it's still growing at 3% and so on. Although there are some pockets that are suffering, I don't know whether they actually. For example, like the agricultural sector, which of course was punished. More than 1,000 items were suddenly banned by the Chinese authorities in the aftermath of U.S. Speaker of the House, Representative Nancy Pelosi's visit. And then I mentioned earlier domestic tourism and all of those industries related to the restrictions of travel and so on. So there are some issues, but largely the Taiwan economy seems to be doing well. Now, under these conditions, voters are likely to think that whether my own situation has actually improved, say, from 4 years ago. So sort of a retrospective voting. But that's just a conjecture at this moment because we don't have access to exit polls. We don't have large-scale election studies, which have to wait at least a few weeks or even a few months. But I think that the economy plays a role, but probably not as large a role as, say, the voters' general impression about the governance of the ruling party and the quality of the candidates.
Okay, Philip?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much what Vincent has said. One thing also related to economic issue is that, I guess, a particular phenomenon in this election is that there's a pretty low turnout from young people, young voters this time, right?
Yes.
I guess part of the reason was because that they felt that what President Tsai had promised them in the last presidential election, for example, the raising the average wage level for youngsters, increasing the employment rates, so on and so forth, especially the wage level, I think in their perception has not been really achieved. So I think that's another factor leading to their relative disappointment with the DPP and the president herself.
Yeah, I think it's worth underscoring that the 2020 election, which the DPP won big, Tsai winning re-election, and the DPP getting a legislative majority, the youth vote for the DPP was really crucial. It made a big difference, and there was a lot of evidence at the time that it wasn't so much deep-seated, undying loyalty to the DPP, but it was faced with the choice, siding heavily with the DPP. All right, so I want to shift gears slightly here in terms of something which you both mentioned as affecting the results in the most recent elections, but something that seems more tied into things we look at going forward, which is this attempt by Tsai and the DPP to frame this as essentially to nationalize the election, to make it about a big issue, particularly cross-Strait issues. And as we saw in this election, we saw the president and those around her talking about a vote for the DPP would be a vote to safeguard the existence of Taiwan, part of an attempt to resist China and protect Taiwan. And the KMT pushback was essentially voting for the DPP means voting for war, means longer military service for young people, and things like that. So really both sides, to a degree, taking on the cross-Strait, the relationship with China issue, but it really started with the DPP. And so, what happened here? Because if you look back at what's happened in the past several years, this is a rather complicated story. After all, the DPP got pretty much shellacked in the 2018 election as bad as it did in 2020, right? Certainly a big reversal from its big gains in 2014. And things looked pretty bad for Tsai and the DPP in 2018, yet 2020, big bounce back, big victory in the presidential election, big victory in the legislative elections. And part of what drove that victory, a big part of what drove that victory, was the China issue. Tsai's ability to frame the 2020 election as a vote for the DPP is a vote for the party that will stand up to China, and you really want to stand up to China now because look what just happened in Hong Kong. Right, the national security law, the crackdown on the protests, China's insistence that the one country, two systems model for Hong Kong was at least a close cousin of what would be proposed for Taiwan. That was a great strategy for the DPP, and she recovered and she won. now here we go, fast forwarding to 2022. And it seems like there's a somewhat similar story one could tell, right? Over the summer, we saw the military exercises that Beijing launched that were clearly quite threatening to Taiwan. China looks like a threat. And yet this time, it doesn't seem to have worked. It doesn't seem that successfully became the narrative that motivated people to come out and vote for the DPP. There are a bunch of disanalogies there that I'm sure we'll explore in the next few minutes, but I just wanted to frame it that way. So let me start with Philip on this one.
Okay. I guess, to quote what Vincent just said, that most voters in this election really care about what you have done for me regarding my daily well-being, daily life, instead of this an overarching big issue of Taiwan standing up firmly against China. I mean, especially for young people, I guess many of them are still pretty much strongly behind China in terms of the strong stance against China. But they really care about those domestic issues that pertains more about their individual level well-being, and that's much more important. Okay, and of course, Jacques pointed out that there seems to be a reversal in the 2020 presidential election outcome against what happened during the 2018 local elections. We don't know if that's going to happen in the next presidential election, but that's always a possibility. Where I think for most elections, which issues really dominate is the prime factor, that in large part dictate the outcome. So that's my take on this question now. Yeah.
Okay, Vincent.
I think the analogy or disanalogy from 2018 to 20 and then now 2022 to 24 indicate to me that the Taiwan voters' preference for this very important issue of cross-strait relations really follows a very, very prescribed guardrail, if you will. So sort of I call this as the law of the golden mean. You're right that right after the 2018 9-1 election, the DPP looked really dismal. But I think that what happened in Hong Kong and Xi Jinping's narrowing of the definition of so-called the 1992 consensus and so on really gave the DPP a new life. The DP was able to frame it very well as a threat to Taiwan's existence. The phrase at that time was 芒果干 or 亡国感. So, Taiwan was facing this existential threat. I think that really was a game, really was a very decisive factor that explained DPP, so Tsai Ing-wen's historic victory in the 2020 election. Now, you recall that an earlier example was just the opposite. When Ma Ying-jeou was seeking re-election in 2012, his slogan was that vote for the KMT because the DPP was very reckless, and the voting for the KMT was the one that would be able to maintain a moderate and a stable relationship with the other side, with the mainland. So the 1992 consensus at that time was called to be a sort of like a magic bullet for cross-strait relations. So these two examples tell me that the Taiwanese voters want a very narrow range of choices. They want a party that will safeguard Taiwan's sovereignty and dignity. And this is another reason why the KMT beginning to vigorously refute the accusation they are a pro-China party. There's no pro-China party now. There's only a status quo party. There's only status quo parties and status quo changing party. I'm referring to KMT and the DPP. And then, of course, when the Ma Ying-jeou's policy became just a little bit too proactive, that what happened was the 2014 sunflower movement, and then of course the DPP's big win in the 2014 election. So I think the Taiwan voters at both the national election and also the local election have mechanism to make sure that their politicians work within this very narrowly defined prescribed guardrail when it comes to national security.
Right, so we have sort of both of the standard explanations in play here. To some extent, midterms are different from presidential and legislative UN elections in that they can at least to some degree be about local issues. And so absent extraordinary circumstances, that the China issue looms a bit less large. That's part of the story here. But I think you're both suggesting that it's also a question of whether the party that is in trouble in any election, including the midterm elections, the 9-in-1s, which are not really midterms, of course, but the 9-in-1s, can be in trouble for being in the wrong place on the cross-strait issues. So Wang and the KMT get punished in 2014 for being too accommodating, moving too quickly, it's seen, on cross-strait rapprochement, something that began under Ma in 2008. Got reelected in 2012, but maybe he was going too far in 2014. And in 2020, the DPP bounces back from a dismal midterm because of the events in Hong Kong that make anything that's not standing up to China or safeguarding Taiwan against China look tough. And maybe there's an element you're suggesting here that the KMT view had some resonance. That is, things with China are really, really bad, and they may get worse under the DPP and sort of trim back to the middle, perhaps. Now, this is a complicated prediction business, and I want to turn to this issue now, which is what does the most recent election therefore tell us about 2024 and the presidential and legislative elections? It's going to be an interesting landscape. Tsai Ing-wen, of course, is term limited out. And Taiwan, during its fully democratized period, has a fairly robust history of the incumbent president getting reelected to the second term, and then the following stretch of 8 years is under the control of the other party, right? We saw that with Chen Shui-bian and with Ma Ying-jeou, and now Tsai Ing-wen certainly ending in 2024. So the advantages of incumbency are gone. Maybe Taiwanese voters, like American voters, tend to swing back and forth between the two parties. 2014, of course, foretold big problems for the KMT in the 2016 presidential and legislative elections. The KMT did badly in the 9-in-1s and then lost subsequently. But as we've been discussing, the DPP's losses in the 2018 election, which were largely replicated in 2020 and made a bit worse in the ways we've discussed, the 2018 round did not foretell a DPP loss in 2020. Perhaps it was Tsai's incumbency. Perhaps it was the Hong Kong development, a bit of both, surely. And where are we now in terms of the hope for the DPP coming up in 2024, when it will be running without an incumbent, when it's just lost the 9-in-1s, and when we have this pattern in recent decades in Taiwan politics of a switch of parties in the presidency every 8 years, a little more complicated on the legislative yen front. And we see this happening with an electorate that isn't really strongly identified with either party, right? About half of voters in most polls say they aren't really identified with either of the major parties or really much of the minor parties, although the DPP has advantages in party identification relative to the KMT at the moment. So what can we glean from the outcome of the 9-in-1s in terms of what we can expect to see in an election which is more immediately consequential, certainly to an American audience and an international audience, which is who will be the president in Taiwan come 2024, which party will control the presidency and the legislature as well. I think I'll start with Philip on this one, then Vincent.
Okay. Let me sort of focus on two factors that may affect the what will happen coming out from the next presidential election in Taiwan. The first is, I said, what the major issue will be. I guess we can expect that the DPP will still be focusing on the issue of cross-strait relations, the issue of standing up firm against China, trying to portray itself as a more reliable party that is really standing together with Taiwanese people, and trying to portray the KMT as soft, as being untrustworthy in terms of resisting China's pressures. Okay, but I think that the whether or not that issue will be effective also hinges a lot on what Beijing will do in the next 2 years or so. Okay, in the past, especially I guess up until President Ma Ying-jeou, I guess Beijing's regular pattern by that time was that it would try to avoid sort of provoking Taiwan by trying to avert encouraging supporters of DPP or encouraging median voters to go for DPP. But I guess in recent years, this pattern has gradually sort of vanished or at least weakened. Partly because as many people suspect that there's been already some sort of either a timetable or a grand strategic plan on the part of Beijing about what it will do, regardless of which party, which kind of political force will be governing in Taiwan. So that's one variable that would affect what Beijing will react, including react to the result of this election that we just witnessed. So that's a major factor, I guess, more than how DPP is able to manipulate the issue of cross relations for the result of the next presidential election. The second factor is who will be coming out from both major parties in Taiwan to run for the presidency. Right now, I think the most likely candidates probably, especially in the eyes of most Taiwanese voters, the incumbent president, Mr. William Lai. He's a quite, I guess, popular politician, especially among the supporters for DPP. On the other hand, I think that there is some possibility, as seen by some observers in Taiwan, that alternative political force within DPP may try to, push for their own favorite candidates instead of Vice President Mr. William Lai. So we'll see how that will unfold. On the KMT side, I think it's quite likely that the Chairman Zhu will try to run for the presidency himself. Though it seems that right now, the major KMT politician with the highest popular support is the newly or the continually elected Mr. Hou You-yi in the Xinbei city. So nobody knows what will happen. But I think Mr. Hou You-yi, according to recent public opinion polls, is the most likely KMT candidate to have a chance to go against to prevail over Mr. William Lai, though William Lai still has a little bit of advantage right now. So that's the two factors. Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent.
So I think we just established that in Taiwan, the incumbency does have some advantage, but it does not extend to their anointed successor. So this is a sort of a starting point. And then in the case of forecasting for 2024, this is actually important because in a formal sense, Vice President Lai Ching-te or William Lai is Tsai Ing-wen's successor. But I think that Lai actually might be somewhat controversial. I don't doubt that he's very capable, but he might be a little bit controversial in that I think he truly believes in Taiwan independence. So this is a candidate that will probably pacify the sort of the darker green elements within the DPP, but that might actually cause some concerns from the cross-Strait or from the U.S. standpoints. On the KMT side, I think that it is true that right now the conventional wisdom is that it's going to be either Eric Zhu, the party chairman, who can take some credit for the election results, or the Xinbei mayor, Hou You-yi, who, according to some polls, proved to be the most electable politician. But I will point out one thing, that predicting 2024, which is only, even though it's only 14 months away, has a lot of variables, because in the several recent presidential elections, there have been more than two candidates. So the third candidate in this case is, of course, most people presume to be the TPP chairman, Ke Wen-je, the outgoing Taipei mayor. And then depending on how much vote he can get, that what happened in 2000 might happen, which is to say that, if the political landscape seemed to favor the KMT, but if Ke Wen-je gets enough votes from the KMT side, then it might actually contribute to Lai Ching-te win. But this is too early. I think that there's still a lot of things happening between now and then, both with domestically and also internationally.
Well, as to paraphrase another line from American politics, 14 months is an eternity in Taiwanese politics. But you both hit upon, I think, the two strains that feed into this. One of which is the party positions on the cross-Strait issue, and as you pointed out earlier, it's really misleading and confusing to talk about a pro-independence and a pro-unification party. That's not where we are. It's each side trying to paint the other as being to the wrong side of the middle position, right? That is the DPP painting the KMT as too accommodationist, and they were given some fuel there when the KMT vice chairman led a delegation to the mainland, incredibly ill-timed in August, just before we saw all the problems of the Pelosi visit and the military exercises. And in the DPP circles, there are concerns that if Lai Ching-te, the current vice president, William Lai, does emerge as the candidate, he has this baggage of having declared himself a warrior for Taiwan independence and having challenged Tsai, indeed, for the nomination in 2020 from a position that was more sort of to the deep green, that is the more extreme wing within the DPP. So there's that dynamic of trying to get cross-strait policy right, something that's worked better for the DPP than KMT in recent years, but not always. But then there's also individual candidates, and as you both mentioned, Eric Zhu Lan, who was the mayor of Xinbei, now party chairman, but he has a sort of checkered history as a presidential candidate. He was reluctant to get in 2016, finally did, and didn't work so well when the KMT had to replace its failed candidate, Hong Xiuzhu. And we have the concerns about Lai that we've talked about, and then we have two people who got reelected by pretty big margins who were talked about as alternative candidates. So Hou You-yi won big in Xinbei for re-election, and as you point out, does very well in the polling. And the alternative, I think, most frequently mentioned to Vice President Lai is Chen Qimai, who just won re-election by a comfortable margin in Kaohsiung. So you do have sort of people waiting in the wings, and we'll see if the 2022 victories by those two possible alternative candidates play out. But you also alluded to, of course, Ke Wen-je, who ran as an independent initially, then founded the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP. Their candidate for the first time won in a local election, if you don't count Ke that way, because he technically was an independent when he ran. Is he a spoiler, and if so, is he a spoiler for whom? The conventional wisdom, is a little muddled on this. These often see Ke described as potentially a little more blue than green in the turquoise spectrum of Taiwanese politics. But if Ke does run as expected as a third-party candidate, does he help? Do you think he ultimately helps the DPP or the KMT, or under what circumstances would he do one rather than the other? Sorry, Philip, do you want to take that one up?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. Okay, fine, sure, yeah. I guess though Ke is still somewhat popular among many young voters in Taiwan, he's seen more as especially his stance on cross-strait relations issues are closer to those of the blue rather than the green camp. So I guess on the balance, if he runs out as a third-party candidate, he's probably going to take more votes away from KMT than from DPP. So that's my take now. But of course, but on the other hand, Ke has been talking about the possibility of campaigning together with some sort of a pan-blue politician, though none of those pan-blue politicians that he's been alluding to, is the current major KMT politician like Eric Chu or any major KMT local officials. So yeah, that's my take now.
Okay, Vincent?
I think the popularity, the undying popularity of Ke Wen-je explains that many Taiwan voters prefer to be a third voice, sort of somewhere between the blue and the green. But Ke Wen-je's or his party's position on many issues are actually not consistent. So I probably would agree with Philip that on cross-strait relations, that party's position is closer to that of the blue. But on other important public issues, that party seems to be rather inconsistent or all over the map. So in the end, how many votes he can get and getting from whom? I think probably he will be particularly appealing to those independent voters who are attracted by neither the KMT candidate nor the DPP candidate. But so the real question is, whether he can play a true spoiler role, which will be a significant factor in the 2024 election.
Yeah, and the TPP and Ke Wen-je occupy a very different place from what we've seen as principal parties in the past. It was very easy to look at in the 2000 election when the KMT effectively split with James Song running what ultimately became the People's First Party, the PFP. That clearly hurt the blue. And then we've had other small parties which were clearly pan-green or pan-blue, right? So the Taiwan Solidarity Union of Li Donghui, the New Power Party, on the green side, and ultimately the more reconciled PFP, the tiny new party, and others on the blue side. But this one really is in the middle, and as you say, somewhat ideologically eclectic, I guess we could say, is the right term. All right, in the few minutes we got left, I want to turn to particularly what this all means in terms of how cross-strait factors will figure in. We've talked about them as an issue, but of course Beijing has some agency in shaping Taiwan's politics. It's not always very adept at it. Sometimes its interventions backfire. We had Foreign Minister Joseph Wu Zhaoxie say that Beijing's attempts to influence this last 9-in-1 elections were actually pretty mild. There wasn't much of what we'd seen in the past, but Beijing clearly has an interest. So what do you see Beijing trying to do as it looks forward to the 2024 elections, especially having seen what I think everybody would say is its favored party? It's not to say an alliance, but it prefers KMT victories to DPP victories, clearly. So what do we expect Beijing to do as it looks towards shaping the environment in which the 2024 Taiwan presidential and legislative elections will occur? Vincent, you want to start on this one?
Well, the conventional wisdom is that Beijing is the uninvited but recognized player in Taiwan elections. So I think the conventional wisdom is also that the Beijing probably prefers KMT because Beijing knows KMT's position relatively better. But I have already mentioned that because of what happened in Hong Kong and also Xi Jinping's more expensive definition of the 1992 consensus, it makes KMT very, very difficult to maintain its historical ultimate unificationist stance. So they are only pro-status quo and pro-status quo plus parties in Taiwan. And I think that the conventional wisdom will also caution us that in the next 14 months, Beijing will likely to refrain from being seen as very heavy-handed or overtly involved in Taiwan elections, because whatever they wish, it always turned out to be the opposite. But I think I cannot say the same thing about this current leadership, because this Xi leadership has been seen as more risk-taking, and therefore it probably will show less respect for Taiwan's the wisdom of Taiwan electorate, and probably seen a heavier hand in Taiwan election. Although the Taiwanese society has learned more resilience in combating the Chinese disinformation and other forms of interference in the local election. In the domestic election scene.
Okay, Philip, you get the last word on this.
Yeah, I agree that Beijing will basically still prefer KMT, but not for the reason that KMT is endorsing all the major policies or stances on key issues in cross relations. It's primarily because Beijing still believes that KMT is trying to refrain from supporting Taiwan independence. But I don't think, pretty much as Vincent just said, I don't think that KMT really has a choice of explicitly endorsing the push for unification that Beijing has been pushing for in the recent 1 or 2 years. Okay. Another important factor I think we haven't been touching upon is really what the U.S. may do between now and the voting day next time. Okay, let me be frank here. The House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Taiwan visit earlier this year, of course, brought a lot of support for Taiwan, especially in the minds of Taiwan people, but also, undeniably brought about this sort of new normal in cross-strait relative military postures, which has not yet been reversed to the original condition. Okay, if there's going to be another similar visit or some other U.S. gestures that made Beijing believe that Washington is trying to encourage or support Taiwan independence, then that will usher in new factors, new variables to lead to the instability in the cross-strait relations even before the voting day next time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for weaving in the U.S. issue, which we did not get to enough here. So let me just close with a comment on that before thanking you and ending this. So, one of the things, of course, that's happened is we had our own midterm elections, which genuinely are midterm elections, unlike the 9-in-1s. They are for the legislature, and they are halfway in between. And we saw the Democrats do better than expected, but the Republicans gain control of the House. Now, this probably doesn't have a great deal of direct and major impact on U.S. policy toward Taiwan and cross-Strait relations. It's a bipartisan issue these days to be supportive of Taiwan and to be pretty critical and suspicious of Beijing. But we will, I think, see some frictions. At the very least, the Biden administration is going to face a lot of questioning from the House and a lot of criticism and a lot of looking for opportunities to criticize, such that any move on any controversial issue could lead to significant criticism. We aren't going to see, I think, an isolationist caucus on the China issue the way we may see part of that in the Republican Party, for part of the party, by no means all, on Ukraine. But with a baked-in pro-Taiwan, relatively anti-China set of positions, it's more about tone and room to operate, I think, than a major change of position. And the final thing we have to look forward to as the election approaches in Taiwan is whoever the presidential candidates from each of the major parties turn out to be, they will make the requisite pilgrimage to Washington and will be vetted for how they will handle cross-strait relations, and that will surely have an impact on U.S. policy, at least around the margins, and can have a significant impact on how Taiwanese voters will vote, because at some level the vote of confidence or lack of confidence from the U.S. is a factor that matters in this very fraught relationship. Well, thank you all for joining us. Great thanks to Philip Xu from National Taiwan University, currently visiting at Brookings, and to Vincent Wang of Adelphi College, who's a longtime friend of FPRI and senior fellow in our Asia program. Thank you all for joining us. In the audience out there, I will urge you to join us for upcoming Asia program events. And as I am directed to say and happily say, these events are free to you but not to us, so please consider joining or supporting the FPRI's programming. Thank you all. Thank you again, especially to Vincent and Philip. See you soon.
Thank you.